and welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. And we are here in a program with the Camden Garden Club's Winter Horticulture Series. And I'm going to be recording this, so it'll be available on YouTube, on the Camden Public Library YouTube channel. And if you have questions throughout or after presentation, you can put them in the Q&A box or the chat box, and I will read them out at the end. So I will turn it over to Lucy Ebert, who's the president of the Camden Garden Club. And the library is so pleased to be working with the Camden Garden Club again for another great series. So Lucy will tell you a little bit about the organization and introduce today's speakers.
Good morning and welcome to the Winter Horticultural Series. Interesting enough, this is the 55th year that the Camden Garden Club has presented this series. So we're well established in the community with this event. This morning's speakers are two ladies who are very accomplished in their fields. Sally Stockton is Director of Conservation at the Maine Audubon and is a wildlife ecologist. Allyssa Gregory is the District Forester and Acting Landowner Outreach Forester to the Maine Forest Service. Their presentation is entitled Forestry and Birds. So ladies, without further ado, please take it away.
Well, thank you very much, Julia and Lucy. We're really pleased to be able to be here today. And I'm going to start out going through some of the slides, and I'm going to be turning it over to Allyssa. She's going to turn it back to me, and we're going to play a little bit of ping pong throughout the presentation. So we'll keep you on your toes, hopefully. But I wanted to start, let's see. Here's our introduction again. And then I wanted to start with just a little bit of background about why Maine is so special for our forests and wildlife. And you may not be aware of this, but we have a lot of, as you all know, we have a lot of variation in the state. If you go from the southern part of the state to the northern part of the state, the coast to the mountains, you see a lot of different types of vegetation, topography, but that difference in ecological terms is equivalent to over 20 degrees of latitude in Europe. So you can see that we have a lot more diversity in a relatively small space compared to over Europe. And as a result, we have lots of different fish and wildlife species that occur here in the state. We have lots of different types of plants and fungi that are present in the state. And we also are in a kind of a unique situation in the east, in that much of Maine is still relatively undeveloped and relatively untrammeled by people. This is a map that was put together by the Wildlife Conservation Society a number of years ago that looks at human footprint, or kind of the impact of human activity on the landscape. The lighter the colors you see here, the light green colors, indicate relatively low impact from human footprint. The darker red areas are areas that have higher impact. And so really Maine is pretty unique in the eastern US in this way. And you can also see that we have some very important wildlife corridors. Those are the big blue arrows there that mark movement from New Hampshire and Vermont into Maine, and then up into New Brunswick and Quebec from Maine. Maine is also home to dark skies. If you look at from outer space, if you look down on the United States and where all the lights are, you see that, again, east of the Mississippi, Maine, that black area of Maine really stands out. That you can still see the Milky Way. You go up into northern Maine in particular, many, many stars. It's becoming less and less common for people to even know what the Milky Way is because the skies are not dark enough to see it anymore. Maine also has a full complement of predators. This is everything from small weasels to our coyotes and lynx and in between. And this is really unique in the East as well. It's because we still have a relative, most of these predators need large areas to for individuals to find their food and nesting and resting areas, and then also to have a viable population. They need even larger areas. For example, our bobcats, one bobcat needs 6,000 acres of land for their home range, what's called their home range. So this is just a reflection of the relatively good state that our habitats are in compared to other places. Maine is also the last stronghold in the US for eastern brook trout. Eastern brook trout need clear, cold water with lots of structural diversity in the streams and in their lakes for finding places to rest, finding places for food, finding places to raise their young. And so we have over 97% of all the lakes and pond populations left for wild brook trout in the east, and 50% of the remaining wild population. And finally, we're going to get to the birds now. So we have over 90 different species of forest birds that breed here in Maine. And this is a map that was put together by National Audubon a number of years ago that identifies where the last biggest blocks of forest habitat remain in the east. And what jumps right out at you, that big block of Maine jumps right out. So that is super important for our eastern forest birds. And it is so important that the National Audubon Society identified this large swath in northern and western Maine as a globally important bird area. That means there are so many different species that depend on this forest for their breeding habitat that it is of global significance. So when we put all that together, we started thinking about, well, we really need to celebrate the special character of the Maine's forests and do something to make sure that the quality of the habitat persists over time. And so what we're seeing, unfortunately, across North America is a very steep decline in most of our bird species and groups of birds. This is a report that came out in 2019 from Canada that shows, if you look at the graph on the right there, you can see that our forest birds are declining somewhat, all birds. This bottom line here, our aerial insectivores are dramatically declining. Most of shorebirds are declining. The only species groups that are doing reasonably well are waterfowl and raptors. And that's because people decided they needed to do something about these declining populations. And Ducks Unlimited has played a huge role, and also wildlife refuges have played a huge role in reinvigorating our waterfowl populations. And then banning DDT and other pesticides has really played a role in bringing our raptors back. But these other groups of birds they're struggling. In fact, there was a paper released in 2019 also in the publication Science that was able to document, based on all kinds of long-term monitoring data, that we have lost nearly 3 billion birds since 1970. Dramatic decline in the number of birds that are out there on the landscape. If we look at this broken down by different species groups, you'll see that 17% decline in our eastern forest birds, 33% decline in our boreal forest birds. So northern Maine is considered part of the boreal forest, and where we have spruce fir forests and sort of somewhat stunted, smaller forests, not as tall. And then also, grassland birds, shorebirds are really doing very poorly, but we're not going to focus on those today. Another thing that we're seeing are dramatic insect declines. Many of these birds depend on insects for their food and fuel. And so there's a connection here that we don't fully understand, but is very worrisome. For example, over in Germany, they're able to document that over a 27-year period, they saw a 75% decline in flying insects in their protected areas. So not just in the landscapes that are manipulated by people, but in the protected areas. And then likewise, we're starting to see disconnection between when insects are available and when the predators that typically feed on them are out busy trying to gather that food. So there's lots of challenges going on here. As I mentioned before, both our eastern forest birds and our arboreal birds are declining. This means if you go out and you walk in the woods today, you're seeing maybe, less than, you're seeing and hearing far fewer birds than you would have in 1970. At least 1 in 4 of our eastern forest birds that used to be here with us are no longer here, and 1 in 3 of our arboreal forest birds are no longer here. That's a dramatic change. I have talked to many folks who have been bird watching for decades, and I've seen this myself as well, that you just don't see or hear as many birds. But we have an opportunity to help them. One other thing I'll note before I move into that is that we are also seeing some new birds come into the state that didn't used to be here. Things like red-bellied woodpeckers are marching their way further north. They never used to be in the state. Tufted titmice. We have gray fox now. We have opossums. We have all these different species that are moving into the state in response to climate change. So some species that are declining and may be pushed further north are in trouble. Other species are coming into the state. So we don't really know where all that is going to settle out over time. But climate change is definitely impacting what's happening. So what's Maine Audubon doing? What is Maine Forest Service and other partners doing to help these forest birds and other wildlife? Well, a number of years ago, we came up with a program called Forestry for Maine Birds. It was based on a program developed over in Vermont, Foresters for the Birds. And we collaborate to work with landowners, foresters, loggers, and other resource managers to think about how you can manage your forest in a way that actually benefits these birds. Because one thing we know is that if they don't have good breeding habitat, if they're not making more baby birds, then their populations are going to continue to decline. So for those of you who are interested in gardening, you already know that different plants, it's nice, have different shapes, different sizes. They attract different insects or pollinators. It's similar to a forest. In Maine, we have sort of 4 major forest types, and 3 of those are illustrated here. We have the coniferous or softwood forest, the mixed wood, which is a combination of softwood and hardwood forest, and then the deciduous or hardwood forest, that are all a little bit different. They have different trees that make up the forest and different shrubs and that kind of thing. And likewise, our birds that breed here in Maine each use a different type of forest and a different place in the forest where they are calling out to find their mates or nesting or looking for food. And so there's lots of different niches within the forest that each different species is sort of prefers. For example, we were talking as folks were just coming on about black-burning warblers. Black-burning warblers love to sing from the tops of spruce trees or other softwood trees. And they're hard to see because they're up really high. But when the sun hits that chest, there's this brilliant orange color that just about knocks your socks off. And then conversely, we have something like the Canada warbler, which likes to hang out on the bottom, near the bottom of the forest floor. They like these down logs. They like to be near water. They're pretty stealthy, so it's hard to see them, but they have this wonderful song that you can hear if you know what to listen for. So, but the thing, and we figured that if we can get people interested in birds and their habitat needs, then they're easy to see, they're relatively easy to find. But once you start taking care of the habitat needs of the different birds, we can also bring along habitat for all these other species. Lots of other wildlife species use similar habitats as the birds do. So the birds are really just a hook to get people interested in their woods and be thinking about how can you take care of these in a way that helps all wildlife species. So here's the Canada warbler I was just talking about. This is another example of how their populations are decreasing across much of the Northeast, and a dramatic sort of population declines here. So this is a target species that we have identified, one of 20 target species we've identified as needing our help. And we know that if we create the right kind of habitat that Canada warblers need, then other species that use similar habitat will benefit as well. So we put together this little mosaic of 20 different species that we call our priority bird species, either because their populations are dramatically declining, like the Canada warbler, or in the case of this black-throated blue warbler here, a very large portion of their population only breeds here in the Northeast. So we want to focus on their habitat needs. And then we have species that are found in open areas. They're what we call our flycatchers they will sit on a branch on the edge of an open area and then fly out and feed on flying insects and then go back to the branch. We have woodpeckers, different kinds of woodpeckers that are feeding on insects underneath the bark of trees. We have warblers that are like softwoods. We have warblers that like hardwoods, younger forest, older forest. So these are just representative of the 90 species that are out there. But in this case, you only have to learn 20 and you can figure out how to take care of your forest. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these next few slides, but I just wanted to give you a closer look at which species we find in which type of forest. So here in our northern softwood, you'll find things like bay-breasted warblers. These warblers key into our spruce budworm outbreaks. And when we have spruce budworm outbreaks, their populations increase dramatically in response to this spruce budworm. They feed on the caterpillars, as do most of our birds feed on caterpillars in the springtime, and they feed their chicks, the young, the caterpillars, because it's kind of like a protein pill for those little birds. Helps them grow rapidly. Northern parula warblers, you typically only find in places where we have the Spanish, what's like the Spanish moss or old man's beard moss. And then black-backed woodpeckers, you typically find on these older stands of trees where the bark is flaking off. They like to feed on the insects right under the flaked bark. In our mixed woods, so this is a combination of softwoods and hardwoods. Again, you might see Blackburnian warblers, magnolia warblers, yellow-bellied sapsuckers, black-throated blue warblers. Actually, sapsuckers are kind of interesting because many of you who've spent time in the woods have probably seen these little rows of small holes that are apparent on some trees. And sapsuckers in the early spring, they'll come in and drill those holes. And then when the sap, and they feed on the sap as it's running in the spring, just like when it's maple syruping time. And then later in the year, insects are attracted to that sap and they feed on the insects in those holes as well. And then in our hardwood forest, one of the species that I really like is the veery. This is it's a type of thrush, just like our robins. And they like to hang out on the very bottom of the forest floor. They're often found near water. You can learn how to recognize them by their call in addition to their visual cues. And they think of water and think of a waterfall, and they like to go veer, 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 veer. So that's their song. And chestnut-sided warblers often like these sort of regenerating young forest areas. And then our oak pine forests, which are probably the most common type of forest in the southern third of the state or so. We have everything from wood thrush, ovenbirds. Many of you have probably heard ovenbirds when you've been out in the forest. They go, teacher, 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 or some people say, pizza, pizza, pizza. And scarlet tanagers you can't mistake them for anything else because they are so brilliant, brilliant red, tops of love, healthy, big oak trees. Okay, so that's kind of the background of what we put together for our priority birds. And then we created a series of guides for folks to help them figure out if you're interested in managing your woodlot with birds in mind, birds and other wildlife in mind. We have guides for for foresters on the right. This is our most detailed and sort of technical guide. We have guides for woodland owners, which is sort of a shortened version, but still has tons of great information in it. And then we also put together a little guide for loggers that they can carry in their trucks with them as they're actually working in the woods to think about things they can do to benefit birds. And we have this keychain of the 20 species and the 4 different habitats that are great for taking right out in the woods with you, trying to remember what we're doing. So our primary goal here is to really encourage more mature, uneven forest stands, because we know that these stands have really high species diversity, age diversity, structural diversity, and wildlife diversity. So now I'm going to turn it over to Alyssa, who's going to kind of walk you through what the different specific habitat features that we want to focus in on are. And the reason we're focused on the more mature stands is not only because they tend to be more diverse overall. It's kind of like an apartment building. The more stories you have, and the more apartments you have on each story, the more places there are for more families. It's the same way with the woods for our birds. But also because right now, these are really underrepresented across the state. Maybe only 2 to 4% of the state is in these more mature stands. So Alyssa, take it away.
Thanks. So this is a
and
quick
please make sure you get real close to your mic so we can hear you better.
Okay, I'm gonna try to yell talk into this. I don't know why my mic isn't picking me up today. So we're gonna do a quick assessment here, and this is something that is designed where you just need your 2 hands. So when you're walking out in your own woodlot, or say you're hiking on a trail, you can look for these key habitat features. And it's a good way to identify what you have on your landscape and also what you're lacking, and things that you can use some forest management to create the aspects that aren't there. So first, we're going to look here on the left-hand side. So these are the features that are our living components. So we have the gaps, and we'll get more into these further on, but gaps, just openings there in our forest canopy that it's allowing sunlight to our forest floor. Our overstory, so that's going to be our taller trees, things that are about 30 feet and higher. And then our mid-story, that's about 6 feet to 30 feet. So trees and shrubs. Understory, that's going to be our herbaceous, smaller than 6 feet. So some smaller shrubs too, like cobblebush and some of the dogwoods and viburnums. And then water features, so streams, ponds, also things like vernal pools. And then looking on our right hand here, we have, these are kind of more of the non-living components. So tree size, also looking at age classes. Sally mentioned mature forests and how those are declining. So that's one of the things that we'll look at there with the thumb. Snags are standing dead trees. You can see in the background of this illustration here that we have what looks like a woodpecker on a standing dead tree. Coarse woody material, fine woody material. You can also see those in the picture there. That's our down woody debris. And then leaf litter. So those layers of leaves that you find in the forest of leaves and needles. Here's a picture here, and Sally, correct me if I'm wrong. I think this was Grand Lake Stream when we did the workshop there. Amanda Mahaffey and Terry Coulong, who is one of our regional enforcement coordinators there. And you can see that they're going through the method on site. So this really is designed for you to do while you're hiking, while you're walking your own woodland. Really easy, you don't have to carry around. They have a folder there where we have materials, but you don't really have to carry anything extra. And it's a lot easier to memorize just knowing you have those 10 things. So first, we're going to talk about tree size. So that was one of our thumbs there on the right-hand side. But before you start looking at size and age class, it's important to identify what cover type that you have. So you'll notice that there's some letters up there on the top right. OP is oak pine, so that's a cover type that you could potentially have. Then there's northern softwoods, northern hardwoods, and mixed woods. A lot of times with our northern hardwoods, there'll be spruce fir, or sorry, northern softwoods will be spruce fir, northern hardwoods, things like our northern red oak and our maples, and then mixed woods, you'll see deciduous and conifer trees together. And looking at our age and tree size, size is not just height, but also diameter. Certain species will utilize larger trees, some smaller, especially when it comes time to talk about snags and picking out cavities. Size can play a big role. And then our age classes too. So Sally had mentioned how we're really lacking those mature forests. But we also have species that rely on having younger forests too. So seeing what your neighbor has and what you have and what habitat components are missing. But just good way to start there is figuring out what your cover types are and what your size classifications are. So this is a great diagram here, and in those handouts, if you've already been curious and clicked the link that I put there in the chat, you'll notice in the Woodland Owner's Guide that this diagram is also present with, in addition to the right-hand side, there'll be a picture of the bird and the nest and where the bird and the nest occurs in the strata levels. So you'll see on the left-hand side, we have that 0 to 6 feet. So number 1, that's our understory. And down below, you'll see understory birds that are going to utilize that space. So one thing that I had learned, I did 4 years of forestry school, but no one ever mentioned to me that birds will usually just utilize 1 or 2 of those strata levels. You won't always necessarily find them throughout the forest. And I had never really picked up on that on my own. So I learned quite a bit my first Forestry for Maine Birds workshop. And just totally realizing that if you're missing one of these components, or, you know, unfortunately more than one, you're really missing out on the overall abundance and diversity of bird species that you could have on your woodland. So we have our understory birds there. Then number 2 is our mid-story. And we talked about how that was like 6 to 30 feet. So smaller trees, shrubs. Sometimes you'll have regen that's getting to that point. Things like our black-throated warbler, which I'll talk a little bit about later, like to utilize those spaces. And then our overstory trees. Those are what we're going to use to classify our cover type usually. So when we're looking at dominant species, we're looking at what's in the overstory. So for example, OP was oak pine. So if you have oaks and pines in your overstory, that's going to be your cover type. And Sally had mentioned scarlet tanagers liking to be in your canopy there. That's a good one to look for, easy to stand out. So moving on here to snags. So when you're walking in your woodland, paying close attention to standing dead trees. I don't usually advocate for snags, we call them snags, near trails or structures, but they're great out in the middle of your woods. As part of my job as a district forester, I make visits to private woodlands when people have more than 10 acres. And we walk the area together and they'll point out these snags and be really concerned. And it's actually something to be pretty excited about. If you know, most of your forest isn't dead, if you just have a few of them, it's awesome wildlife habitat. Sally had mentioned bird hotels. Well, there are some birds who their hotel preference is these standing dead trees. And not just having one age class or size of these standing dead trees, having multiple and a variety of dead snags. You'll see here the pileated woodpeckers, which if you've never seen one in person, they're a pretty large bird, almost crow size. And also things like wood ducks. Wood ducks will utilize snags. That's they're also very large birds. And if you've never seen the videos of the baby wood ducks hopping out of wood duck boxes or snags, it's adorable and you should check it out. There's lots on YouTube. But they use these snags as cavities. They'll excavate the hole there and raise their young. And you know, bigger birds are going to need bigger trees, and then smaller birds are going to prefer, you know, excavating and utilizing smaller ones. So just keeping a variety of standing dead trees in your forest is great too. I also wanted to mention with the snags too, just real quick that, and I'll mention that with the down woody debris too. NRCS has programs through the Conservation Stewardship Program. They have treatment options where if you don't have snags on your property, so if you're doing this assessment at home and you realize, hey, I I just don't really have that many snags, or maybe you utilize them for firewood. I know fuel costs are really high, and if you have a woodlot, you're probably utilizing it. There is an option and ways that you can girdle larger trees, and NRCS will have incentives to help offset those costs. And with down woody material, so if you're remembering there on our right hand, there was large down woody material, and that's going to be things that are about 6 inches in diameter, 4 feet long. And then our small woody debris is going to be twigs, tops of trees that are broken off and into much smaller piles, little branches. So here you can see, I believe this is rough grouse who's drumming on a piece of coarse woody debris. So not only is coarse woody debris great for tertiary insects and hiding places for amphibians, good hunting grounds for birds, but it's also used for mating displays. They do this really incredible and sometimes terrifying if you're not expecting it in the woods, sound and display. It just kind of echoes through the forest. If you've never heard it before, it's pretty incredible. So not just for food and cover, but also mating displays. And then that small woody debris, how we kind of talked about with snags, how some species prefer larger snags, same thing with smaller. So small woody debris is going to be essential for keeping your abundance up too. And not just birds that are going to utilize your down woody debris. So you can see here, I think that's a little fisher who's utilizing the down woody debris as a walking path through there. Looks like I can't tell quite from this photo, but maybe there's some raspberry he's walking through and can kind of use it as a balance beam through it. It's great to have piles. I strongly discourage people from piling all of their down woody debris, because as we talked about, you need it kind of spread out throughout the property for birds and other wildlife to utilize, and also for it to break up and build up the organic matter in your soil. But you can choose to make wildlife piles, doing a few that larger mammals can use as hunting grounds, smaller animals can use as cover. It's also great for insects, and they do break down eventually. This is probably my favorite picture. So this is an ovenbird utilizing leaf litter, and for them to build their nest, they need a pretty significant amount of leaf litter. It's a couple of inches at least. They're just the most precious little birds that, as a forester, we talked about how certain birds only utilize certain strata levels or layers of your forest. The ovenbirds are down in the understory, so I'm fairly short. I'm only 5'4", so I see these guys quite a bit, and they're pretty good at camouflaging. Though I've come right up to nests before and just been so close to like almost stepping on them or stepping right over them. But keeping that leaf litter in your forest, letting it build up organic matter, but also providing that cover and space for insects so birds can hunt as well. All right, so we're moving on to our other hand here and talking about gaps. So this is one method that you can implement that's a little bit more hands-on. We had talked about girdling trees if you don't have them present in your woodland, but also looking at if you're walking through your forest and you notice that your canopy is completely closed. There's no sunlight getting down to the forest floor. You're not seeing anything or not much in the understory, maybe just a little bit in the midstory. It might be time to consider creating gaps. So back before we had European settlement, there was much larger trees on the landscape. Those were cleared over time for farm and agriculture land, and then it was reforested, and we've just continually harvested, since we've been here. So we don't really get as many large gaps, because when our trees fall down naturally in the forest, they're smaller, so they're not making as big of gaps. So we can go in there and kind of mimic natural forest succession and take 1 or 2 clumps of trees. Sometimes bird species will require larger areas. I think for grouse and woodcock, if you're going to create flocks and things like that, you have to clear and get larger regeneration areas. But for a small gap like this, great for peewees. They can see the insects flying They can perch on these pine branches and watch, so they have a good view. And we talked about if you're not seeing things in your understory and your midstory, you can notice on the right-hand side of the screen, we have some pine regeneration. So we're not, maybe didn't have a lot going on in the midstory or understory, and now you're getting some of those intermediate shade tolerant species coming up. I'll just very briefly mention forest succession, because I think this is kind of a good place to do that. Depending on how large of a gap you create, will kind of determine, there's some other factors, but it will help determine what species of trees are going to grow there. So we have some tree species that have a really high light requirement, and those are normally our early successional species. So one of the first things that comes in after a major disturbance that have a high light requirement. And we do have bird species that utilize those areas. As you can imagine, with timber harvesting, we have a little bit more of that on the landscape than we do have mature forests. But if you're looking at your neighbor's property and yours, and maybe like Sally, you have a conservation land trust or something around you, and they don't have any early successional habitat, that might be something to think about if you're wanting grouse or woodcock, creating those regeneration patches. And then things that, if you're making a smaller gap, you'll get things that are a little bit more shade tolerant. So pine, it'll grow in open conditions, but it's prone to weevil kill. There's a pine weevil that'll target the silhouette of the tree. It sees the very top of it. That's how it knows it's a pine tree. So if it's growing up with other trees and it's partially shaded, it's less likely to die or be defected with pine weevil. And then really small gaps, you'll get shade tolerant species coming in. So creating gaps and some structure in your property, great idea. We talked about with that guide with the different layers. If you're missing just one of those components, how many birds you're truly missing out on. And if that's something you're interested in doing, say you're doing this assessment and you notice when you get to your cover here or to your gaps, even size and age class, that you're not seeing it, contact your local district forester. I'll have a slide here towards the end. We can put you in touch with natural resource professionals who can help develop a woodland resource action plan for you. And they'll take the guesswork out of this, so you don't have to figure out what areas to make these adjustments. Been saying this a lot lately. We are lacking mature forests and late successional species. And it takes time for these things. So it's not like how we discussed with gaps where we could hire somebody with a chainsaw to come out and create it. This is something that takes a lot of time. It takes some planning. So if you are going to have a timber harvest on your property, or say you're thinning for firewood, identifying your legacy or your remnant trees. So there's a picture there of Sally measuring a 37-inch diameter hemlock tree. So figuring out those trees that were left over from previous harvests or even past land use. I'll teach you something really quick here. It's easier to point out when you're in the woods, but if you see a large tree with really large diameter lower limbs, that's usually a sign that it was open grown. Because if you're walking in a forest, you'll notice they're putting up all of their energy towards the canopy. That's where you're going to see most of the branches. So if you're seeing them lower down, then they were more than likely open grown because they were still receiving sunlight farther down. And those are not good for timber. So there's not necessarily a good point in taking those. They're usually pretty knotty and less desirable, but they're awesome for wildlife. Great perches, so many different species that can utilize those. So great things to hold on to, keeping those legacy trees, even maybe flagging them or painting them just so you know that you want to keep those, and identifying areas of your forest that has the potential to be a mature or late successional forest. So if you are interested in having a plan compiled for your property, letting your stewardship forester know, hey, I'm really interested in some late successional habitat. Can you identify pieces of my property that could meet those features that could help these species? And they can help you do that. If you have some trees where you think that they could have the capability to become larger and more mature, you can also thin around them. We call that a crop tree release for timber harvesting, but it can also be done for wildlife. In fact, for wildlife, they also call a lot of times them crop tree releases because they're oaks or pine that are providing a food source. But for timber harvesting, it's a crop because eventually they're wanting to use it for timber products, but you don't have to use them for timber products. You can cut around those soon to be larger diameter trees that have the capability to reach the canopy and ensure that they're getting more resources and water. Okay, riparian areas and wetlands. So moving right along here, water is super important. Another feature that we can't really change or shouldn't change. I've seen areas where water is being redirected on properties with catastrophic results. But water features on a property are not only habitat, not only a source for food, but they also offer these contiguous corridors across boundaries. So you and your neighbor may have a property boundary that's divinely marked, but chances are that buffer around your wetland or your stream is still going to be there. So it provides this protection while they're moving, so they don't have to go through cleared areas. It also is preventing erosion, your forests around your wetlands and waterways, and preventing pollution from getting into the water. So keeping your forests intact near water, great idea. And you'll notice during timber harvesting that Maine Forest Service has shoreline area maps that tell you how much of a buffer you have to leave and how much cutting is allowed. And I always tell landowners that have streams and wetlands on their property, if they have a wildlife goal, but those are the minimums. That's the bare minimum. You can, as the landowner, and fully your right to do so, tell people or your operators, I don't want any equipment within 100 feet. I don't want any within 300 feet. It really, any sort of forest activities that take place on your property should meet your goals. And if your goals are wildlife, having a larger buffer around water resources is generally what's recommended. Okay, so let's summarize some of the stuff we've learned with our quick assessment. So this is, we'll pretend that this is our woodlot, and we're taking a look through here, and maybe we're noticing that there's not much of an overstory. So when you purchase this property, maybe there was an overstory removal. So we're going to encourage a more vigorous canopy. So figuring out which trees here are more long-lived, have the potential to be our mature canopy overstory, and cutting around them to encourage them, give them more resources to really try and get a more robust canopy going. Things like we've mentioned scarlet tanager, they really like the canopy. So if we don't have it, we're going to be missing out on those guys. Okay, what's another thing we're missing here? We'll see like maybe some really tiny gaps, but we don't have any major gaps here. And things like we had mentioned the peewee, I think that's what that is. Yeah, peewee needs those gaps for its hunting grounds and prefers kind of like those edge habitats. So coming in here and cutting, maybe some of the diseased or defected trees, creating some gaps so that they have habitat. Let's see, I can see through this picture pretty well from where we're standing here through the other side. So we don't have much of a mid-story. We mentioned having multiple strata levels when we're talking about diversity. So not just diversity of species, but also of those layers. So coming in here and creating the gaps like we were going to do for the peewees will also encourage some more growth through our understory and midstory. Is that a thrush? I think it's a thrush, right, Sally? All right, we've got
yes, that's our wood thrush.
Wood thrush. All right. I can usually identify it if it's a thrush. I can't get it down to which kind, but that's another one I see out in the woods pretty frequently. And also looking here, I'm not seeing any standing dead trees. So we could opt to girdle one of our larger trees here to encourage our pileated woodpeckers or sapsuckers. So maybe doing some girdling to get a snag tree here. And understory. So we talked about how we didn't have much of a midstory or understory. So we're going to be missing out on those black-throated blue-sided warblers. Sally had mentioned that they really like hobblebush. Hobblebush is great, great native species to encourage there. I think they like moister sites. Also things like viburnums, some of the smaller dogwoods, just encouraging some of those shrubbier species. And then ground cover. We have a little bit of fern, some down woody debris, but not a whole lot. And for ground cover, we need that leaf litter for our little oven birds. Don't want to don't want to prevent those guys from making their nests. And then down woody debris, we had that picture of the rough grouse drumming. But we have a lot of species that utilize down woody debris that aren't birds either. So keeping that on your forested landscape. I think the biggest issue I have when I'm doing what's called the walk and talks with landowners, when I visit with private landowners, is that people want their woodland to look like a park, but we are managing for forests, not for parks. So we want that down woody debris, as long as it's far away from structures, to build up that organic matter and give these guys some habitat.
Yes, we like to tell folks that messy is good. If your forest looks messy, that actually means it's providing good habitat for wildlife.
I'm going to turn it back over to Sally here.
So as Alyssa mentioned, it's really important to think about how your particular property, or maybe you're involved with your local land trust and they have some forest land that they're trying to manage. Think about how that property fits into the larger landscape around you. As we've mentioned a couple of times, we want different age and size classes of the forest out there on the landscape. But right now we're skewed heavily towards our young and intermediate forest. What you see here is a graph of our desirable landscape goals would be only about 10 to 20% in a young forest, so less than 25 years, 20 to 40% in intermediate to be about 20 to 70 years. That's what most of the landscape in Maine is covered by right now, in part because of forests regrowing after the heyday of the agricultural era 70 or so years ago, and in part because we have continued to harvest our forests periodically throughout the last century. And so these older age classes are quite uncommon, and particularly the really mature forest age class. So our goal would be to have at least 40 to 50% in this older age class, and at least 10% of additional area in forests that are over 100 years old. As I said, these are extremely rare, and it takes time. As Alyssa said, it takes time to build that forest up over time with all of the different attributes we've been talking about. You don't necessarily need to have forests that are over 100 years old to have these older forest characteristics, though. And so there's a lot of opportunity to take a forest that's a younger forest or an intermediate age forest and actually do some harvesting that helps create these other structural complexity features, habitat features we're looking for. And then one of the things that we've been doing with land trusts and so water conservation districts across the state is to create these demonstration forests where people can go and actually look at what does it look like after you've created a gap? What does it look like after you've gotten rid of invasive species? And we've created a series of informational signs that we have available that can be tailored to any particular site that informs folks about what is a canopy gap, what is a can't see what these other ones are. Snags or 3 layers of vegetation. And so anyway, that's just, it's people seem to really like these, and we're working with more land trusts and water conservation folks on getting more of these signs out there. So it's a great way to learn and see firsthand what things look like. And then another addition we're working on right now for our Forestry for Maine Birds program is a Forest for Fish section that really focuses on that riparian area, that area adjacent to water that Alyssa was talking about, because Maine has a lot of water. We have 25% of the state is wetlands, and then we have many, many hundreds and thousands of streams and lakes and ponds. And a lot of our wildlife use these areas, either use the water itself or the areas adjacent to the water. We know that 85% of our vertebrate species, that is animals with backbones, use the riparian habitat adjacent to streams and ponds sometime during their lifetime. They also use those, as Alyssa hinted at, as travel corridors, moving from one property to another property. or one forest patch to another forest patch. So these riparian habitat areas are super important, and finding a way to sort of minimize the disturbance within those riparian habitats is really important. And one thing you may not, so here's a lot of different species on the screen here that use these riparian habitats, but one thing you may not know, Alyssa mentioned wood ducks. Wood ducks and mergansers are cavity nesters. They nest in trees that can be easily a half a mile or more away from the water. So that area adjacent to the pond or stream that where they eventually take their young is really important. And so, you know, how we manage the forest really matters. How we manage the forest and who is out there doing the logging activity, how the operations that they're doing really matters. And we know that from scientific research that's been done in various places, that less heavily harvested stands have more structural diversity. And in that case, we're talking about multiple layers, both vertically and horizontally. We have more of that dead wood, more hollow trees. We have thicker and healthier organic soils. There's less surface runoff because the vegetation can keep down the erosion. And the other thing that has been getting a lot of attention recently is that these forests also store more carbon. And this is an important way that we can help facilitate or sort of mitigate the impacts of climate change that we're witnessing. And so there's a lot of interest right now in focus on the importance of these more structurally complex older forests for not only from a bird and wildlife habitat standpoint, but from a carbon storage standpoint. And I'm just going to run through a couple of sort of summary slides, things that you can be thinking about as you go forward, and then turn it back to Alyssa to talk about where you can find more help and resources. Again, ideas promote mature forest stands that have multiple layers of vegetation, small canopy gaps, dead standing trees, and dead down wood. All of those things are really important. Who would have thought that dead wood was so important, right? We tend to think, oh, it's messy, it's ugly, we want to get rid of it. But actually, it's super important. So both the live and the dead elements in the forest are valuable. And then we talked about the importance of these riparian habitats, not only for fish, but for birds and other wildlife that rely on these riparian habitats. And we have a little problem here in Maine that many of these riparian habitats, many of our streams are disconnected because there are the culverts are blocking passage of fish moving up and down the stream, or dams have been put in place. And so there's tremendous effort across the state to reopen some of these streams and get rid of old dams that are no longer being of use. And so we are at Maine Audubon, and in collaboration with many other folks in the state, we have a Stream Smart program that where we are replacing these poorly functioning culverts with these open arch culverts, so that not only the water can move up and down, and when we're seeing more extreme storms, it's less likely to flood over the road, but fish and wildlife can move through these culverts instead of having to go up and over the road as well. So now I'm going to turn it back to Alyssa to finish everything up.
My video back on here. All right. So we've talked a lot today about different habitat features that you can encourage on your property to get overall abundance and diversity of birds visiting your woodland. I talked a little bit about the Woodland Resource Action Plans. If you think that that's something that would be a good fit for your program, please reach out to your district forester. I have this map here that has all of the district foresters' contact information. You can also find this on the Maine Forest Service website. If you Google Maine Forest Service District Forester, this is like the first thing that comes up. Actually, I think my name is the first one that comes up because it's alphabetical. But we can help you find a forester in your area to help you make one of those plans. We can also walk your woodland together. So if you want to take a hike together, walk your forest, we can give you basic recommendations. So just check out that map there. We also have, with the Inland Fisheries and Wildlife, a private lands biologist, Joe Roy, who does visits on private lands, 10 acres or more. So if you're interested in more wildlife habitat recommendations, having Joe come out would be great. A lot of times Joe and the district foresters will get together and do the visit the same day. That's always fun. Let's see here. Make sure Joe's email's there. So if you want to email him.
I'll just go back for that second.
Yeah, I'll put it in the chat here too for you guys. Because his is a little bit harder to find. There we go. So you guys should all have that in the chat now. And then the next program I wanted to talk about, so I mentioned the Woodland Resource Action Plans. That's part of our WoodsWise program. And right now we have additional funding. So we have money to help pay for some of those Woodland Resource Action Plan components. For WoodsWise East, we have even more money set aside to help make a robust wildlife section. And we have 3 targeted species here, the American woodcock, black-throated blue warbler, and eastern brook trout. So for landowners that live in the Down East area and some of the northeast portions of Waldo County, you have the option to get additional funding for a more robust wildlife section. That's not to say if you don't live down east that you can't talk to your forester about including more wildlife habitat features in your plan. It's just not required with the regular Woodland Resource Action Plan. So this WoodsWise program, it's for people with 10 or more forested acres. Don't be discouraged if you don't have 10 acres. You know, even my parents have a fairly small woodlot in Bingham. You can still go through the conservation districts. You're really fortunate there in Camden having the Knox-Lincoln Conservation District, Soil and Water Conservation District. They have what's called a landscape certification program, and they have a checklist that has a lot of questions about wildlife habitat features and food sources, water sources. So if you are interested in doing woodland management to encourage wildlife, I would talk to your conservation district too. Rebecca, Julie, and Louisa, they're fabulous. That's it for me. We have our contact info there.
All right, so that's it. And we thank you all for listening, and we were happy to entertain questions. I know we're bumping up right against the hour mark, but we're willing to stay a few extra minutes if anybody has questions for us.
Thank you so much, Alyssa and Sally. I learned a lot during that talk. So yeah, anybody, you can type your questions in the Q&A box. And it looks like you were already able to answer a few questions that people had since you were kind of tag teaming. So that's great. And okay, here's one question from Amy. And she says, what would you recommend people with hemlock on their properties to do proactively to start to plant to replace with an appropriate species any hemlocks in case they don't survive the HWA infestation that is happening in many parts of Maine? We also have beech leaf disease. It is very daunting to get a plan or even consider what to do, and help will definitely be needed from people who are schooled and skilled in forest management.
So my first recommendation would be to have a stewardship forester take a look at the property. It's hard to give planting recommendations without knowing the soils and seeing the site. It's really unfortunate that we're losing those hemlock stands because, as we discussed, we're losing mature forests. We don't have as many. And a lot of times hemlocks were our mature forests. When people were deciding what land to use as agricultural fields, a lot of times when they saw hemlock, it was kind of an indicator that it was going to be cool, rocky soil and not really easy to convert to agriculture land. So sometimes that was left alone, and a lot of our older growth forest is hemlock. So it's great to be proactive. Having a plan with that hemlock woolly adelgid in mind would be a fabulous idea. So if you have concerns about hemlock woolly adelgid in your woodland, reach out to your district forester, have somebody come out there and take a look, see what's already coming up in your understory. Unfortunately, with hemlocks, there's not usually much of an understory or midstory. And I didn't mention this during the presentation, but don't be discouraged or implement those gap openings in your hemlock stand. Hemlocks should be dense with lacking understory and midstory. In fact, if you do a cut in a hemlock stand, they usually just extend their branches and you won't get much going on in the understory anyway. You have to thin them pretty heavily to get anything else to grow with them. So it's definitely a good idea to be proactive and get a plan going now before you lose all of your trees. I did post in the Q&A a really excellent article from Vermont talking about managing hemlock stands in northeastern forests. Especially they have a section, I believe, in there about hemlock woolly adelgid, if I pasted the right article. So that's a good one to take a look at, but great question.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
Alyssa, based on the conversations I've had with different foresters, you're going to get different ideas about what to do with hemlocks. So you kind of have to sort through that. Some people are saying, don't do anything until it's a real problem. Other people are just trying to sort of get ahead of it and perhaps do as you suggested, plant some new things there or cut some down. But the forester that we work with here in Cumberland, where I live, he's of the opinion that leave it alone until we have to deal with it. Because there are some stands that are probably going to persist. We just don't know which ones.
All right, thank you. So another question that's come in is what has the population explosion of turkeys, what effect has that had on songbirds? That's from Edith Cornwall.
I've never really thought about that before. I mean, turkeys they eat a lot of acorns, so they eat other insects. I would doubt that they've had much impact one way or another on other songbirds because they're down on the ground, they're moving through the forest. They certainly will roost in trees, but they wouldn't be aggressive towards one another. So I kind of doubt they've had much impact. I don't. Alyssa, do you have any other thoughts on that?
No, I know in some instances turkeys will go through and eat up all the seeds on the ground when they descend like locusts sometimes, but haven't really heard where they're impacting other species populations so much. Mainly just gardens.
Yeah, well, a similar question is, has the increase in the raptor population had an effect on songbird populations?
Most of our raptors feed on small mammals. It's not entirely true. Many of our raptors feed on small mammals. Some raptors will also feed on other birds, but those weren't the ones that were necessarily diminished by the DDT situation. So things like broadwing hawks or, goshawks that will fly right through the forest after maybe chasing another bird. Those weren't decimated by DDT the way that our bald eagles or ospreys were. So I think that that's probably not a big deal. However, we are seeing with the increase of bald eagles that has occurred here in Maine over the last decade, I will tell you that we work a lot with common loons in the state as well. And we're getting a lot of complaints from people now about how the bald eagles are attacking my loons. And so that there is interplay between different species that way. And we just say, it's part of nature. I'm sorry. I know it's really hard to watch sometimes. Some of my cousins have seen bald eagles come in and snatch a young, week-old loon right off the surface of the lake, and fly off with it. But the adult loons are getting better at recognizing the threat and being aggressive in their protection of the chicks and getting a little more smart about how to protect them from bald eagles. So they're always having to, these poor songbirds are always having to juggle finding enough food, finding a nest site, and then protecting themselves and their chicks or their young from other predators. So
yeah, it's a hard life being a songbird, I think.
Hard life. It's a hard life.
Okay, here's another question. This person wonders if it would be worth mentioning that, or they're wondering if increasing keystone native plant species for increased insect caterpillars would help birds.
Yes, please do it. At Maine Audubon, we also have a program called Bringing Nature Home, where we are promoting the use of native species. And one of the things, and maybe the person who asked the question is familiar with Doug Tallamy, who is the one who sort of crafted this. He wrote a book called Bringing Nature Home, and with his permission, we were able to use that same title for our program. We're actually growing our own native species and encouraging people to plant native species, because we know that the native species are used by many more caterpillars. For example, our oak trees sometimes have up to 300 different species of caterpillars that use these oak trees, whereas non-native species don't. The berries are not, they're typically, for example, we've got terrible glossy buckthorn out in the forest behind me, and the berries, there's lots of berries on those, but they're diuretics for the poor birds. And those plants will displace our native species that have both the caterpillars and the berries that are much more nutritious for our native birds.
Thanks, Sally. So Sarah Lynn Eastler is wondering, on a smaller property with a diverse woodlot, 3 acres, what species should we try to encourage by including man-made habitat like nesting boxes in the mid-coast?
Bats are always a good one. Bats, and then things like, if you have open, I don't know if your yard is open, but if it's kind of, if there's open areas, then things like tree swallows and bluebirds are really great. Both of those species have suffered a lot of declines. Any cavity nesting birds, even our chickadees, they will sometimes use those small cavity boxes. And chickadees would be in a forested area, not just, so that you've got some options there.
Okay. I think we have time for maybe a couple more questions. Here's one from Ali Daly. Is avian flu an issue for wild birds?
Yes, it is. In fact, last summer, we have a program that protects endangered piping plovers and least terns on our beaches on the state. And our field crews that were out there every day were seeing a lot of gulls and other seabirds that had been washing up on the beaches, that they was probably from avian flu. So it's definitely a potential threat. It hasn't, we don't think that it's yet gotten to a point where it's really abundant and a huge problem, but we're sort of going to be watching out for it this next year. There's not a lot we can do about it, but it's definitely out there and definitely a problem.
All right. Thank you everyone for your questions. Now I'll just hand it back over to Lucy Ebert, the president of the Camden Garden Club, to say a few words. But thank you so much, Sally and Alyssa, and thank you to the Camden Garden Club. This has been wonderful information. I'm seeing a lot of people in the chat saying that they've learned a lot, and this was exactly the information they needed. So thank you so much. And Lucy, I'll leave you to it. I think you're connecting to audio. Oh, we can't hear you, Lucy. One moment, everyone. Sorry about that. Okay. Technical
Okay.
difficulties. Oh, there you
Yes.
are.
Questions? I got lost video.
We can hear you now.
Okay, are we ready?
Go ahead,
Okay, I
Lucy.
guess. Okay, at this point in time, I just want to thank Sally and Alyssa for a very in-depth program about bird forestry. There's so many things there that we can do, and you've opened a lot of doors to us. Likewise, I want to thank Julia at the Camden Library for hosting us. And of course, I've got to do a plug for the Camden Garden Club. If you want more information about our organization and our program, please visit us at our website, which is camdengardenclub.org, or you can, if you want to really become a member, you can email us at membership@camdengardenclub.org. And looking forward to next week, which is Valentine's Day on February the 14th, we will be discussing yardscaping, and we look forward to seeing you at that time.
Thank you so much, Lucy.
Thank
And
you
I
so much
also,
for attending.
thank you. And I encourage everyone to check out the Camden Public Library website. We have lots of things going on, as always, including, as Lucy mentioned, the rest of the month, talks from the Winter Horticulture Series with the Camden Garden Club. So thank you, everyone, for joining us. And until next time, thank you, Sally. Thank you, Alyssa.
For having us. Have a good day, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.